Hey guys, Treasure here with another video for you. Today I'll be showing you how to add piping to your leather bags. If you have not already seen my previous leather tote making tutorial, you might want to check that out before watching this because I'll be using a lot of the same techniques from that video in this video. Additionally, since I had some of the leftover Redrock leather, I'll also be using that in this video as well to make this duffel bag. If that is something you're interested in learning, then continue watching. So for starters, with any project, you want to take your pattern pieces and trace them out to the base of your leather and lining if you are using lining. Right here, I'm just going ahead and tracing out the 1/4 inch seam allowance that we will be using to stitch our piece together, lining and exterior included. Once you connect all the dots for your 1/4 inch seam allowance, go ahead and cut out all of your pieces. And just a heads up, you guys, you will start to notice color variations between frames in this video. I'm not sure what my camera thought it was doing, but I'm making a bag. So here we are with our pieces, and what you want to have for your duffel is 3 main exterior pieces and the same amount of pieces for your lining, in addition to your pocket if you decide to use a pocket, as well as your side gusset pieces. I went ahead and folded the top portion of my pocket over by a 1/2 inch and gave it a nice base stitch. What that does to me is give it a nice finished look instead of leaving the edges raw. When it comes to using softer leathers, you want to leave it as clean and finished looking as possible. And of course, if you watch the tote bag tutorial, then you know I've already added my iron-on fusible fleece to the lining. That just gives it some nice stability and structure. And just to touch base a little more on leaving your edges raw, for the pieces that will be visible that I do not want to turn inside, you want to make sure that you add some type of edge coat. Again, it is all about making sure your bags have a nice finished look. Because of the size of our duffel bag, we'll be using a separate zipper tape and zipper pull instead of a finished zipper. Quick tip, if you've never done this before, all you'll do is place your zipper pull onto the teeth accordingly. Once you have that in place, you'll just loosen up the teeth even more to give it some space to glide, and you should be good to go. When it comes to piping, which is the main objective of this video, there's a couple different techniques to achieve that piping look. For this technique, I'm just using a strip of leather folded over and stitched alongside of it. It does not include actual piping, but it does still give the same visual appeal as if you are using leather piping. As long as it is flexible enough to fold and bend, then you should be good to go. The second technique is actually using a really small strip of rope to place in between a strip of leather, and you will stitch alongside of that as well. Please make sure that your rope is also flexible and soft so that as you are stitching around certain curves and turns, you won't have any issues. And this is how your piping should look, especially when it is placed properly in between 2 pieces of leather. So moving along, I already added the leather pocket to the lining, stitched it into place, and added some double cat rivets to keep everything from shifting around should our threads start to get old and loosen up. I also added the zipper tabs to each end of the zipper. And now I'm going to start working with one pocket side of the gusset because I'm not using 2 pockets, I'm only using one, and this one pocket will include piping as well. So as I've told you guys before, I like to create as I go. So I'm actually doing this for the first time. I have done piping before. I've never added piping to a pocket. So in order for me to hide the top portion of where the piping seam is, I want to make sure that strip of leather covers it entirely. When adding piping, you want to make sure your piping is a little bigger than the actual pocket size, just in case any malfunctions. You want to make sure you can cut it off if you need to. When it comes to the end of the piping, because we will be stitching it around the base of a bag, you want to open up this corner piece and pull out that piping and cut that piece off so that as we start to turn and stitch around our corners. We don't have any extra unnecessary pucker that shouldn't be there. This helps for a seamless stitch. FYI, if you are wondering about this particular piping here, I do not have any answers for you. I've actually had this piping for the longest. I usually keep stuff from older collections or bags that I have made for experimental reasons, and today we are experimenting. But that is also why I showed you the two different techniques of how to create your own piping. And if you do happen to use the rope technique, you would do the same as far as cutting off the two ends so that it makes it seamless to stitch if you need to stitch around corners or weird areas. As always, I like to keep everything into place using clips just to keep the leather from shifting around when I start stitching. And because I'm running out of double-sided tape, I wasn't able to tape the whole perimeter of the area that I'll be stitching. When you have your piping into place, you can cut off the sides or any excess leather that is hanging off, and that'll give you a nice finished pocket. In order to add our piping to the zipper area, we need to finish up our lining, so that's what I'm going to do here. One piece of the lining will connect to the larger portion, which will also connect to the zipper area. In adding our piping to the zipper portion of the bag, you want to make sure that your piping is a ½ inch longer on each side, and you'll see why in a second. And again, we'll be taking the ends of the piping, cutting that off to give us a smooth stitch once we start putting everything together. If you don't know by now, here we are again with my best friend, double-sided tape. It just helps keeps everything into place, especially as we start stitching. You don't want to have to keep reassuring that your pieces are in alignment. The double-sided tape is really a big help for that. Now that we have our piping in place, we can go ahead and add more double-sided tape to the portion of the bag where we will be attaching our lining, piping, and zipper. Now that we finished the piping along our zipper area, we can go ahead and finish the interior lining and sew everything together so that we can start moving on to the piping around our gusset. Because we will need to turn our bag inside out, what we're going to do is just stitch off the corners of our lining and leave the middle section wide open. Comes to adding the gusset, whether it be the lining or the base of the bag, I like to start with the top portion and the bottom center portion. Once I have those two areas pinned off, then I work from the right to the left, and then I start to stitch around the entire gusset to make sure everything is in place. Once everything is pinned into place, now we can stitch everything together. I again like to start with the top portion of the gusset. In this process, I'm actually moving the leather piping out of the way. I will not stitch that in until I have the base of the gusset ready to stitch. And we have our gussets nicely stitched into place. Everything is nice and centered. You guys, trust me on this technique of starting with the top portion of the gusset, moving on to the bottom, and then working from the sides in. It really has helped in making sure my gussets come out nice and even. Now we're just going to move on to finishing up the base of our bag. I went ahead and folded the bottom portion of this leather at a 1/2 inch seam allowance and added some leather glue just so that when we do turn our bag inside out, nothing is shifting, which is not preventable when you are using double-sided tape. So that's another technique for you. If you are turning your bag inside out and you don't want things to shift, just apply a thin layer of leather cement and let that dry maybe 30 to 40 minutes. I actually didn't start this until the next day, so it got to dry overnight, but this is a great technique to use as well. I already stitched one side so you guys could see how it looks. Now I'm going to stitch the other side, and you can see how strong the leather is attached to one another. So as we're stitching, we should not have any issues. This inside out technique of stitching requires a lot of movement, which means I'll be shifting the leather around and moving it around just to make sure this stitch line is completely even. So when you are doing this technique, you have to make sure your leather is tacked together. Now I have tried using the strongest double-sided tape for this particular inside out technique, but it never fails. It always looks like my stitch line and myself had a fifth of bourbon and we just decided to drive off a cliff. We do not want that. We want our stitch line to look like we actually care. And there you have it, a stitch line that looks like we care. Another quick tip, because our piping exceeds the side seam, we want to tack it together so that once we attach our gusset, everything catches once we start stitching. We don't want our piping shifting around or coming out of place. We need everything to be fully stitched together. Lastly, when it comes to adding the piping around the side area of the gusset, we want to, of course, add some double-sided tape so that the piping stays in place, and you'll start to see the whole reasoning for that in a second. Again, I always start at the top of the gusset and work my way around. Once we get to the bottom center, you will need to overlap your piping, which means you'll have to cut off the tips of your piping so that there's no bulkiness in the stitching and we can actually overlap the pieces smoothly. When you have everything into place, it should look nice and even all the way around. You can now take your gusset, align it with your bag, starting at the top of the gusset again, pinning it into place, and then you can start your stitching. The most important part of this step is to make sure that as you start stitching around that you are actually catching the piping in between both pieces of leather. If you miss anything, something will be out of place, out of alignment, and it'll look crazy once you turn your bag inside out. So now we'll do the same thing with the pocket side of the gusset. The only difference is that we will tack our pocket into place in 3 spots on the bottom and on the 2 sides. This just reinforces that the pocket does not move around as we stitch our piping into the actual bag. The last tip for this side, we want to make sure that this area right here that includes a lot of bulk and layers of leather, that we open this portion of the piping up and cut out the actual pipe. That way when we turn the bag inside out, it doesn't look like a big lump because that's what we stitched over. We want to make it as seamless as possible. And of course, for the very last portion of the bag, once we have that last gusset stitched into place, that portion of the lining that we left open, we can now utilize that to turn our bag inside out, making sure that our lining fits nicely inside. Once everything is into place, you can go ahead and take that lining, pull it out, pucker it together, and stitch it for closure. And that is that. Once you have everything stitched into place, you can go ahead and add your center handles or your arm strap handle, whatever you prefer. And now you have a nice Redrock leather bag with lining and piping for detailing. As always, I hope you guys really enjoyed this tutorial. I know I enjoyed making this bag. There is something about adding piping to a leather bag that just gives it a whole nother dimension of quality. If you decide to make this bag, make sure you put your own spin on it and tag Weaver Leather and Nikki&Mallory. We would love to see your design. In the meantime, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and leave us a positive comment. Thank you guys for watching. I will catch you on the next one.